Hi guys, I hope you're doing well tonight. And before we slip quietly into the coldest winters of the Middle Ages, I want to welcome you gently and invite you to settle comfortably, because what follows is a slow, drifting journey into a world where warmth was scarce, nights were long, and entire families fought the cold with nothing but their bodies, their routines, and their stubborn will to see the morning. And before we begin, I want to ask you to hit the like button, only if you truly enjoy these slow, immersive stories, to subscribe if you want more nights like this, and to tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is right now, because I love knowing how far these quiet tales travel across the world. And now that you're here, breathing slowly, lights dimmed, the room calm around you, let's walk softly together toward a tiny medieval village, wrapped under a heavy blanket of winter, the kind of winter that steals sound from the air and makes every breath feel like a thin ribbon of frost slipping between your lips. And as your boots sink into the snow on a narrow dirt path between low timber houses, you sense immediately that this world does not forgive the unprepared, because even the strongest men could freeze to death if they misjudged the night by a single hour. So you pull your cloak a little closer and listen to the crunching snow beneath your feet as the pale blue twilight settles over the village like a long exhale. Thin trails of smoke spiral from a few chimneys, but they promise no real warmth, because peasants rarely had enough firewood to burn through the night. And as you walk between these dark shapes, you realize that the houses themselves seem to shiver, their walls made from wattle-and-daub, light and porous, and unable to hold back the cold. And when you place your hand on one, you feel the truth immediately. The winter pushes through the wall as easily as water through cloth, and you understand why families inside huddle together, not just for comfort but for survival. Around you the village moves with slow, careful purpose, men stacking the last bundles of sticks, women closing the shutters before the wind picks up, a child kicking snow from his shoes before ducking into a doorway. And all these motions ripple outward like a quiet ritual shaped by centuries of necessity. Because when chores slip even slightly, winter punishes without hesitation, and you can smell frozen mud, damp wool, and the faintest trace of smoke drifting from hearths that glow more in hope than in heat. A dog barks once in the distance, sharp then swallowed instantly by the heavy air, and you keep walking, feeling tiny snowflakes melt on your eyelashes, while the sky dimly hints at another storm waiting in the wings. And as you pass a doorway, you notice a small carved wooden figure placed at the threshold, its surface smooth from generations of hands, a charm villagers believed could discourage frost spirits from creeping into the house at night, a belief half superstition and half psychological comfort, in a world where fear and faith often slept in the same bed. You brush your fingers over the figure, the wood cold enough to sting, and then you move on as the last of the daylight drains away, the village folding itself inward like a creature preparing for hibernation, each window glowing faintly with firelight that flickers against gathering frost, flames trembling as if tired from a long day of trying to warm a world too vast and too cold to care. And slowly you realize you are no longer thinking of winter as a season but as a presence, something alive in the air around you, something that presses its weight on your shoulders like a heavy cloak. And as you approach a small doorway glowing with a dim red light, you duck inside and feel the cold loosen its grip on you. Just a little, not enough to be called warmth, but enough to remind you that even the smallest difference in temperature meant survival. Inside the cottage, the air smells of earth, wool, and dying embers. The walls built from woven sticks plastered with daub, rough beneath your touch, straw poking through like tiny bones. And as you crouch near the hearth, nothing more than a shallow pit with dull embers hiding under ash, you understand instantly why medieval families cherished fire, as if it were a living member of the house. And with the door closed behind you and your breath forming faint clouds in the dimness, you begin to absorb the quiet truth of this place. People here did not survive winter because their houses were warm. They survived because they learned how to sleep inside the cold, how to share heat with one another, how to fight drafts with rags, moss, and mud, how to keep embers alive until morning, and how to let their own bodies become the hearth when the fire failed. You stand there for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the muted glow of the embers, and slowly the details of the room begin to rise out of the shadows. The low beams overhead stained dark with years of smoke, the single small window boarded tight with a wooden shutter, and stuffed around the edges with scraps of wool and dried moss to keep the night from slipping in. The packed earth floor tamped flat by countless feet until it feels more like leather than soil, and as you take a few slow steps inward, you realize how little space these people have and how carefully every inch is used in the battle against the cold. To one side of the room you see the bedding arranged not as separate little nests, but as one broad, low island of straw and cloth, a raised pallet made from rough planks, laid across simple supports and piled high with rustling straw. And when you crouch down and press your hand into it, the stalks crunch and bend under your fingers, prickly yet springy, lifting whoever lies there just enough above the icy ground to keep the worst of the cold from crawling straight into their bones. Over the straw lies a worn linen sheet, its weave uneven and rough, threads pulled and thinned by years of washing in cold water and drying near smoky fires, and on top of that a chaotic but deliberate stack of woolen blankets and patched garments, heavy tunics long since retired from daytime use, stitched together into a single thick layer, cloaks and shawls ready to be spread over everyone at once like one great animal pelt. You watch the family move with the slow, practiced rhythm of people who have done this every winter night of their lives. No wasted gestures, no hesitation. The mother smoothing the straw with her hands, shaking out the coarser pieces toward the edges where adults will sleep, leaving the center a little softer for the children. The father checking a gap in the wall near the pallet and pushing more straw and a twist of moss into the crack, his fingers red and stiff but determined, and nearby the dog circles twice on a faded scrap of cloth before curling up as close as it can get to where the smallest bodies will lie, because even the heat of one animal becomes a treasure when the temperature hovers just above freezing. You notice a few stones near the hearth, rounded and dark, pulled earlier from the edges of the fire, and now resting on a flat shard of broken tile. When you hover your hand above them, you feel that deep, slow warmth that comes from something that has soaked in heat all day, and you understand the quiet plan here, because soon those stones will be wrapped in cloth and slipped under blankets near cold feet and cold bellies, little pockets of stored daylight smuggled into the long night, a simple trick repeated across countless villages where firewood is too precious to burn just for comfort. In some places, people whispered that warm stones invited gentle spirits who watched over sleepers, but whether that belief was mystical or just a way of giving meaning to a practical habit, the result was the same: a child clutching a warm bundle in the dark and feeling just brave enough to fall asleep. The mother calls softly and the children, already heavy with drowsiness, shuffle toward the pallet in layers of wool that hardly ever leave their bodies in winter, long shirts and rough hose patched at the knees, sleeves pulled low over hands, and you watch as they climb into the very center of the bedding without needing to be told, one curling on their side, another pressing close behind, a third tucking their cold toes under a sibling's knees. You can almost see the heat building there like a faint glow in the air, because human bodies pressed together share more warmth than any small fire in a leaky house could ever manage. And historians who write about such nights describe how common beds were not a romantic idea, but a blunt survival tool, an arrangement where privacy dissolved into the more urgent need to keep the youngest and weakest wrapped in the safest ring of heat. The parents wait a moment, letting the children settle and murmur and sigh into the blankets. Then they take their own places at the edges, the father closest to the wall where the drafts will creep first, his broad back forming a shield against the cold that slides down the plaster and along the floor, the mother lying on the other side near the open space of the room where stray currents of air still wander, and somewhere between their feet the dog finally nests, a warm knot of fur pressed against whoever's toes it can find. No one voices the pattern, There is no spoken rule, but you can see that the stronger bodies take the harsher positions on the outside, while children and elders sink into the center where layers of flesh and wool and straw hold the cold at bay for as long as possible. You let your hand drift along the nearest blanket and feel the texture of the wool, coarse and scratchy. Yes, but undeniably alive with the capacity to trap heat. The lanolin still clinging faintly to the fibers, giving off a subtle oily scent of sheep and earth and smoke. And as you pinch the cloth between your fingers, you realize how different this is from anything soft and light in your own world. Because here warmth comes from density and weight, from layers that press down gently and keep the air close to the skin. And people often go to bed wearing almost everything they own, cloaks and caps and mittens included, turning their own bodies into small furnaces wrapped in their day's labor. From beneath the pallet, you feel a faint tremor rise through the planks and up into your knees, a slow shifting movement like the heartbeat of the house itself, and you remember that directly underneath this room, in the darkness below, the animals are lying in their stalls, the cow exhaling clouds of steam into the hay, goats huddling flank to flank, their warmth rising all night in invisible waves that seep through the boards and mingle with the heat of the sleeping family. And you suddenly understand how clever this arrangement really is. One space stacked above another, humans on the upper layer, animals on the lower, all sharing the same fragile bubble of slightly less cold air in a world that would gladly freeze them separately. The sounds begin to change. The clatter of evening chores has fallen silent, replaced by the soft symphony of a house settling into sleep, beams creaking gently as the timber contracts in the deepening cold, the faint whistle of wind testing the edges of the shutters, the tiny clink of a cooling pot near the hearth, the rustle of straw as someone shifts their weight and searches instinctively for the warmest hollow, the distant, comforting grunt of a cow resettling itself below, and all these sounds weave together into a kind of slow, repetitive lullaby that does not chase away the cold but teaches you how to share the night with it. You move a little closer to the pallet and sink to your knees, feeling the chill of the floor seep through the fabric at once, and the contrast between the air down here and the air hovering above the shared bed becomes immediately clear. The space over the blankets holding just a thin layer of warmth, only a few degrees perhaps, but enough that breath there feels softer, less sharp, and you imagine what it must be like to slide under those blankets, still wearing your heavy clothes, to feel the first shock of cold straw against your legs, then the slow, spreading comfort as another body leans into your back, another hand finds your hand, another pair of feet search for your ankles, until you are woven into a single human knot that breathes and warms itself. You can see now that this is their real heating system, not the feeble ember in the hearth, nor the drafty walls, nor the thatch above, but this tangled arrangement of bodies and wool and straw and animal warmth, this quiet, stubborn habit of lying close enough that your breath fogs the air in front of someone else's face, and their heartbeat becomes part of the soundscape of your dreams. And as you watch the last cloak settle over the family and the room dim into a deeper shade of red and grey, you feel the slow drowsiness of this medieval winter night, reaching out to you as well, inviting you not to fight the cold alone, but to inch closer to the pallet, to lie down at the edge, to pull the rough blanket over your shoulders and learn, the way they did, how to sleep inside the coldest winters of the Middle Ages without ever truly escaping the chill. You remain there a moment longer, close enough to feel the heat rising from the shared pallet, yet far enough that the cold still lingers around your knees, and as you let your breathing fall into the slow rhythm of the sleepers, you begin to notice how the atmosphere of the room shifts once the family fully settles into the night. Because medieval darkness is not simply an absence of light, it is a living presence, a thick velvet shadow that fills every corner of the cottage and softens every sound. And slowly you begin to feel that the boundary between waking and sleeping here is thinner than in your own world, something that the people who lived in these winters understood instinctively. After a while, with the embers dimmed to nothing but a faint red memory beneath the ash, the cottage feels suspended in a strange quiet, that is not silence but a tapestry of tiny sounds woven together so gently that they almost lull you into a trance. The faint murmur of straw rubbing against cloth as someone shifts ever so slightly, the delicate whisper of wool brushing wool as a child tucks cold feet deeper under a sibling's legs, the brittle creak of a timber beam contracting under the weight of frost, and from below the steady, slow breathing of animals whose warmth bleeds upward through the floor like a muted heartbeat. You kneel closer and reach out to touch the frame of the bed, the wood smoothed over decades of use by hands that lived and died within these walls, and as your fingers close around the edge you feel the vibration of the sleeper's breaths travelling faintly through the planks, a soft, slow pulse that comforts you more than you expected, because in this world where the cold presses against every seam and corner, it is the sound of breath, human and animal alike, that reassures you that life is still holding on. The air around you grows heavier, denser, filled with the faint musky scent of wool and smoke, and the warm earthy smell drifting through the floorboards from the animals below, and you realize how easily this combination becomes a kind of lullaby for people who have known no other kind of night. Your eyelids begin to droop, even though you are only a visitor, and you imagine that if you allowed yourself to lie down at the edge of the pallet, the warmth radiating outward from the nest of bodies would pull you into sleep, the way the tide pulls gently at the shore. You take a slow breath and look toward the window, where the shutter trembles subtly with each gust of wind outside, and for a moment you imagine the night pressing its cold face against the wood, searching for a gap, a crack, any small weakness through which it might slip, because even the thickest daub walls are not perfect barriers, and everyone in this cottage knows that the cold does not give up simply because the door is closed. It prowls along the outer walls, slides under the threshold, seeps through the tiniest hole like a patient predator that is willing to wait the entire night for its chance. A thin draft glides across the floor and touches your ankle like an icy finger, and you instinctively draw your leg back, feeling a brief shiver prick at the base of your spine. Even inside this house, even surrounded by layers of straw and cloth and heavy wool, you feel how fragile warmth is, how easily it can be lost, how desperately people long ago clung to it with every trick and habit they knew, and you understand without needing anyone to explain that falling asleep here was not something done lightly. It was something earned. Your gaze drifts again to the children nestled in the center of the bed, their small faces half buried in the blankets, breaths rising and falling in soft clouds that vanish into the darkness, and you feel an ache of tenderness that surprises you, because in this place where winter pushes everything to the brink, these tiny sleeping forms feel like the very heart of the house, the reason the parents endure, the reason they build the fire pit, fix the walls, mend the hose, fetch the water, gather the twigs, patch the drafts. They are the warmth that justifies the struggle. Then, slowly, you begin to sense a subtle shift in the room's rhythm, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft way that long nights deepen into their second layer of darkness, the point at which the first deep wave of sleep begins to recede, when the ember of wakefulness glows faintly inside the mind, and the medieval body, shaped by centuries of practice, drifts into the natural pause between first and second sleep. You straighten your back slightly and listen more closely. One child turns onto their back and lets out a small sigh. The father shifts his weight on the outer edge, where the draft is strongest, and pulls the rough wool cloak higher over his shoulder. The mother murmurs something soft and wordless in her dreaming state, perhaps a fragment of instinct rather than speech. And beneath you the animals adjust themselves as well, hooves shifting in hay, the goat exhaling a deeper breath as if sensing subtle movement above. You picture the countless nights across countless generations, when this same moment unfolded in the same gentle pattern, when people woke not fully but lightly, allowing their minds to wander for a few minutes or an hour before sinking again into the deeper, heavier second sleep, a rhythm so natural for their long, fireless nights that it did not require explanation, only acceptance, and perhaps even a faint sense of comfort in knowing that the night was not one long stretch of darkness, but two softer waves of rest separated by a moment of quiet existence. You rise slowly, careful not to disturb the sleepers, and step closer to the hearth where the ember glows like a single watchful eye beneath the ash. And as you kneel beside it, cupping your hands around the faint warmth, you can almost imagine yourself living here, waking in this in-between hour and stirring the embers with practiced tenderness, blowing gently to keep the spark alive, listening to the night breathe around you, and feeling for a moment like you and the house and the animals below, and the wind outside are all parts of the same vast, slow-moving winter. And as the ember brightens just faintly under your breath, glowing like the soft pulse of the cottage's heart, you realize that the medieval winter night is not only cold and long, it is layered, breathing, intimate, and deeply human, shaped by habits that kept people alive, not through warmth, but through rhythm, togetherness, and the quiet rituals performed in the hours between sleep. You remain kneeling beside the ember for a long, gentle moment, listening as the deep quiet of the night settles into its second, heavier silence, a silence that somehow feels warmer, thicker, more lived in than the stillness that arrived after dusk. And you begin to sense that the cottage itself has shifted around you, becoming less a building and more a breathing creature, its wooden ribs creaking softly, its floor vibrating faintly with the slow stirring of the animals below, its walls holding the heat of the sleeping family like cupped hands around a candle flame. You stand slowly, careful not to break the fragile pocket of warmth surrounding the pallet, and as you cross the room you feel the cold reclaiming the lower air, brushing your shins with an icy gentleness that makes you draw your cloak tighter, the draft flowing silently along the floor like a pale river of winter. And you realize once again that warmth exists here only in layers, higher near the bed, faint near the ceiling, barely present near the floor, and almost non-existent along the walls where frost creeps in tiny glimmering threads. At the far side of the room you notice a simple wooden table, rough and unpolished, holding a few everyday tools left ready for the morning: a wooden spoon, a small knife with a bone handle, a clay cup with a chipped rim, and beside them a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, their faint scent drifting toward you in delicate waves. You lift the bundle and bring it closer to your face, inhaling the soft sweetness, something like mint, something like dried flowers, something faintly earthy, and you realize these herbs were gathered months ago under a warm sun the family can barely remember now, harvested and hung to dry so they might bring even the smallest comfort on nights exactly like this one. You set the herbs down gently and run your fingers along the tabletop, feeling grooves worn into the wood by generations of hands preparing meals, mending clothes, whispering nighttime prayers, or telling stories during the quiet mid-sleep hour when only the embers watched. You can almost hear laughter here, or a whispered tale, or a soft conversation between parents checking on one another without waking the children. This table has held moments as fragile as breath and as vital as bread. A faint rustle from the bedding draws your attention back to the family. The father turns slightly, his body shifting into a more protective curve, one arm draping over the blanket's edge, as though guarding the warm circle behind him. The mother murmurs again, the sound little more than a breath shaped into a syllable, and the children barely stir, their warmth preserved in the tight tangle of limbs and wool. You step closer and feel the heat radiating from their shared center, a soft human glow that weakens the sharp edges of the cold, pressing against the rest of the room. You crouch again and slip your hand just above the blanket surface, not touching, just hovering, and the rising warmth gathers around your palm like a tiny invisible hearth, gentle, persistent, alive. There is something deeply grounding in this, something that reminds you that warmth here is not a luxury but a resource created, not by fire but by people, by bodies, by breath, by closeness. You rise once more, letting your gaze drift across the cottage, and for the first time you notice something subtle near the door, a soft, trembling patch of moonlight sliding along the floor through a tiny gap where the plank has warped over the years. As the wind outside shifts, the light flickers ever so slightly, like a ghostly fingertip tracing the floorboards. You kneel beside it and feel the cold seeping through the crack with a steadiness that makes you shiver. This is the sort of draft that could chill toes or fingers within minutes, and you imagine how many times the parents knelt here after the children fell asleep, stuffing moss or cloth or straw into the gap to slow the night's intrusion. Your fingers brush a strip of cloth wedged under the door. It is stiff, damp along the edges, its fibres rough against your skin, and you understand that this simple scrap is as important to the family as any blanket, a barrier against the creeping tide of freezing air that looks for every opportunity to slide across the room and slip into the warm nest on the pallet. A quiet sound rises from beneath your feet. You pause, tilt your head, and listen closely. There it is again, the slow drag of a hoof against hay, the soft puff of a cow's breath, the faint rustle of straw as a goat scratches its flank. The animals below are waking lightly, sensing the shift toward morning long before the sky brightens. Their warmth rises into the room in tender waves, mixing with the breath of the sleepers above, creating a subtle but vital envelope of shared heat that sits just high enough to protect the family from the full cruelty of the cold. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine lying above them, feeling the faint vibrations of their movements travel into your bones, knowing that the animals are as much a part of the night's survival as the blankets or the fire pit. This layered living, humans above, animals below, forms a single winter organism, each half depending on the other in ways that feel almost sacred. You open your eyes again and notice the frost beginning to form along the beam above your head, delicate as lace, shimmering faintly in the moonlight that slips through the shutter's cracks. The cold is tightening its grip outside, drawing the world into a deeper stillness, and yet in this tiny cottage, something warmer and older is happening, a slow drifting companionship between the sleepers, the embers, the animals, and the house itself. You sit down once more beside the hearth, the cold earthen floor numbing your legs, but the ember glows faintly beneath the ash, pulsing with a small, stubborn resilience. You can almost see the image of a parent waking in this mid-sleep hour centuries ago, leaning close just as you are, blowing gently just as you did, watching that fragile ember brighten for a heartbeat, then letting it rest again in its shallow crater of ash until morning. You feel the weight of the night settle around you like a heavy cloak, and the slow rhythm of the cottage begins to pull you inward, nudging you gently toward the same drifting state that holds the rest of the family in its warm center. You sit quietly beside the hearth, until the faint pulse of the ember begins to soften into a dull, sleepy glow, and then, almost without noticing when the shift begins, you sense that the long winter night has reached its deepest point, that silent hour when time feels suspended, when even the wind pauses as if drawing one long cold breath, and the cottage settles into a heavy stillness that seems older than memory. You rise slowly, your joints stiff from the cold floor, and move toward the sleeping family again, watching how the blankets rise and fall in one slow, unified rhythm, the children curled so tightly in the middle that they look like one breathing shape, tiny hands tucked beneath chins, cold pink noses pressed into wool, soft hair scattered across rough cloth like small threads of gold and chestnut. And as you stand over them, you realize just how much heat this small cluster of bodies produces, enough that the air above them feels warmer, almost tender, while only a few inches beyond the edge of the blanket. The cold waits with quiet patience. You kneel beside the pallet and let your hand hover just above the blankets once more, and the warmth rising from beneath wraps around your fingers in a soft, faint wave, barely enough to call warm by modern standards, yet powerful enough in this world to protect these children from freezing, powerful enough to mean the difference between waking or not waking at all. For medieval families, warmth was not a temperature. It was a strategy, a habit, a ritual, a way of arranging bodies and cloth and animals into a fragile but life-saving shield. As you stand again, your gaze drifts toward the window, and for the first time tonight you notice something subtle. The darkness there has shifted, just barely, from the thick animal black of night to a softer, thinner grey, the earliest breath of dawn pressing gently against the shutter like a hand feeling its way into the room. Dawn in a medieval winter is not bright, not golden, not warm. It is a pale, cold presence that arrives quietly, sliding into the cottage like mist, bringing no comfort with it, only clarity. And as that thin grey light deepens, you begin to feel the cold change its tone, moving from the heavy stillness of night into the sharper bite of morning. A thin draught crawls along the floor and touches your ankle again, colder now, more insistent, and you instinctively tuck your leg against your body, feeling the urge to step closer to the pallet, to borrow the warmth that the family has made together. But you remain standing, and instead walk toward the shutter, placing your hand against the wood. A sharp chill bites into your fingertips immediately, and you pull back before the cold can numb them completely. This is the cold that wakes people in this world. Not the gentle light of morning, but the sting of air pressing through the cracks, reminding everyone that there is work to be done before frost claims the house. You turn back toward the hearth and crouch again, brushing aside a thin layer of ash until the ember beneath reveals itself like a tiny red eye opening in the dark. It glows faintly at your touch, pulsing once with the memory of heat, and you understand instantly that this ember is the first task of morning, the tiny heartbeat that must be coaxed back into flame if the room is to become survivable again. You lean close and blow softly, warm breath fogging the cold air, and for a moment you see the ember brighten, its dull red turning briefly orange before relaxing again into a sleepy glow. You imagine the father doing this every morning of winter, kneeling in the same spot, feeling the same cold bite into his knees, whispering something faint under his breath, maybe a small prayer, maybe just an exhale of determination, as he rakes the ash aside and feeds the first scraps of dry twig into the tiny crater. Behind you, a soft murmur rises from the bed. One of the children shifts, pulling the blanket higher over their shoulder, their breath forming a small cloud that disappears almost immediately in the cold morning air. The mother stirs next, her hand instinctively reaching toward the children, checking their warmth even before her eyes open. She pulls one closer, her fingers brushing a tuft of straw, and you see the faintest tremble run through her body as the first sting of morning cold presses against her sleeve. Even half asleep, she knows what time it is. Not the hour, but the season. Winter wakes you before dawn because it must. You take a few steps back and watch the family slowly begin to surface from the soft darkness of second sleep. It is not a sudden waking. It is a slow rising of awareness shaped by centuries of routine. The father turns first, shifting his weight off the coldest edge of the pallet, pulling his cloak tighter across his chest, his breath thick and white as he exhales into the dim light. His eyes open only halfway, but his body already knows its job. Check the ember, check the children, check the drafts, check the animals. A medieval morning begins with duty, not comfort. You see the moment when he looks toward the hearth, noticing the faint glow you coaxed back to life, and he leans forward with a slow groan, joints stiff from cold and work and age. He kneels by the fire pit exactly where you were moments ago, and stirs the ash with his hand-worn stick, pushing the ember gently to one side, before placing a few thin twigs over it, then blowing with practiced patience. The ember brightens again, flickering, testing the air, but it is still too weak, and he knows it, so he blows again, slower this time, letting the breath warm it before feeding it into flame. Behind him, the mother pushes herself upright, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders like a cloak, and as she sits there for a moment, blinking into the cold light, you see frost glistening in her hair where her breath froze during the night. A thin silver dusting traces the edge of her shawl, melting slowly as her body warms the fabric. She rubs her hands together briskly and murmurs something soft to the children, who begin to turn under the blankets, their faces pink from the cold, their noses red, their hands emerging reluctantly from the warm hollow they created during the night. One child coughs once, a dry, small sound, and the mother immediately reaches for them, checking their face, tucking them deeper into the wool, before lifting the edge of the blanket to let a bit of warmer air pool beneath it. The father glances back, his face tired but calm. Winter mornings often begin with worry, but worry is just another part of the day's work. You watch the faintest flame finally catch on the twigs, a thin ribbon of orange licking upward from the ember, and the father shields it with his palm, coaxing it into a small but steady fire. It is not much, barely enough to warm the air an arm's length away, but it is a promise that the morning will be bearable, that the cottage will not freeze from the inside out, that breakfast can warm the children's stomachs before chores pull them back into the frozen world outside. The animals below begin to stir more loudly now. A cow shifting, a goat stretching its neck, the soft thud of a hoof pressing against wood, and their warmth too rises gently into the room, a quiet reminder that life here survives through layers: human breath, shared blankets, straw pallets, warm stones, and the steady living heat of the creatures beneath the floor. The family begins to sit up fully, rubbing eyes, pulling cloaks close, flexing cold fingers, and looking toward the faint growing light around the shutter as the first pale glow of morning finally announces itself. And standing here in the dimness, watching this simple but extraordinary ritual of waking, you understand that medieval mornings were never warm, never gentle, but they were full of small triumphs. An ember rescued, a breath of flame coaxed to life, children held close, blankets shaken free of frost, and a day begun with the stubborn, quiet courage of people who endured the coldest winter not by fighting it, but by learning to wake inside it. You watch as the father coaxes the small flame into something steadier, feeding it with thin twigs that crackle faintly in the cold air, and soon the pale morning light, the hesitant little fire, and the warm breath of the sleepers all begin to mingle softly in the dimness of the cottage, weaving a delicate boundary between the world inside and the world outside, a boundary so fragile you can feel it shifting with every flicker of the flame. The mother swings her legs over the edge of the pallet and stands slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders like a shawl, her breath drifting in small clouds as she moves toward the hearth. She kneels beside the father and places a thicker piece of kindling at the fire's edge, easing it into place with fingertips red from the cold. Her movements are slow but practiced, guided by years of mornings just like this one, and you sense that she knows exactly how much wood they can afford to use. Not one twig more than necessary, because every scrap is counted, measured, rationed for the weeks still ahead. The children begin to wake next. At first they only stir beneath the blankets, their small bodies reluctant to leave the soft warm crater they created during the night, their toes curling instinctively toward the last pockets of heat. One child rubs their eyes with balled up fists, another buries their face deeper into the wool before peeking out again, cheeks flushed pink from the cold that seeped through the outer layers of blankets while they slept. When the youngest one sits up, their hair stands in little static tufts, a mix of straw, wool fibers, and the night's warmth tangled into a riot of soft curls. The mother lifts the blanket briefly to let the warmer air from the hearth drift beneath it, a tiny morning ritual she performs without thinking, a gentle act of care that allows the children to start their day without that first painful shock of cold hitting their skin. One by one they emerge, still swaddled in their layers of wool clothing, their breaths visible in the dim light as they gather around the hearth's new spark, instinctively reaching out their hands to feel even the faintest warmth. Beneath the floor, the animals grow more restless. You hear the cow shifting its weight, hooves pushing into hay, the soft swish of a tail striking the air, the familiar low rumble of a stomach waking to hunger. A goat bleats softly, the sound muffled but insistent, and you realize that the animals know the pattern of the morning just as well as the humans do. For them too, survival is a rhythm: warmth, food, routine, movement, and their quiet restlessness tells the family that another day must begin, whether the world outside is ready or not. The father stands slowly, joints cracking softly in the cold, and moves to the trapdoor at the far end of the room. He lifts it with both hands, and a wave of warm, earthy air rises from below, carrying the smell of hay, damp wood, and the soft musk of animals. He nods to himself, relieved the warmth held through the night, and no creature seems distressed. He drops the trapdoor back into place gently, then wraps his cloak tighter around him as he prepares to step outside. Before he reaches the door, though, he pauses and looks toward the small clay pot sitting on the table, the one they keep their precious embers in during long days away from home. He checks it the way someone today might check a wallet or a phone, making sure it is exactly where it needs to be before stepping into the cold. Because if the fire in the hearth ever dies completely, this little pot could become the last spark they have. The mother gathers a small pot from the corner, its sides cold and slightly damp to the touch. She sets it near the hearth to warm slowly before she adds water, because in this world even the water inside the cottage is often frozen solid by morning. You can see the faint sheen of ice clinging to the inside of the pot, a thin crystalline skin that will melt only when the morning fire grows strong enough to push its warmth into every corner. You step closer, watching her place her hands briefly around the pot, breathing onto it, her fingers stiff and cracked from winter. You can almost feel the sting that runs up her arms when cold water finally touches her skin, the kind of cold that burns before it numbs, a daily cruelty that medieval families endured with a quiet, tired acceptance. The father unlatches the door and pushes it open just wide enough to slip outside, and a blade of freezing wind slices through the gap, cutting across the room like a whip. The children recoil instinctively, the dog too, ears pulling back as the cold rushes in. The mother shields the youngest with her arm, then quickly closes the door behind the father, sealing the cottage again as best she can. Outside, the father trudges through snow that crunches under his boots with a brittle, glassy sound. You imagine the brief image he sees: a sky washed pale with pre-dawn light, roofs sagging under crystalline frost, fields stretched empty and silent, the cold so deep that even the air seems frozen in place. Inside, the mother moves with growing determination. She checks the herbs drying near the rafters, shakes loose a few powdered leaves into the pot warming by the hearth, and begins gently scraping the frost from the inside of the window shutter with her fingernails. The children start their chores too. One gathers the straw scattered from last night's bedding. Another folds the blankets into a more compact bundle to preserve warmth for the evening, and a third sits quietly rubbing their hands together, blowing warm breath into their palms while watching the small flame grow in the hearth. The dog slips closer to them, lying down with its back to the hearth, its body absorbing heat and sharing it with the children who press against its side. Even this small moment, a dog warming the morning air, carries centuries of meaning, animals and people relying on each other in one unspoken, unbroken chain of winter survival. The mother kneels once more at the fire, feeding it a thicker branch now that the flame is fully awake, and as the flickering light spills across the cottage, revealing the first clear shapes of the new day, you sense something stirring quietly through the room. Not warmth, not comfort, but resolve. Because in this world, the day does not begin with ease. It begins with endurance, with the soft stiffness of cold fingers, with tasks repeated endlessly, season after season, with the slow rebuilding of heat in a house that loses it faster than it can hold it. And as the first thin beam of pale winter morning light finally escapes through the crack in the shutter and lands across the packed earth floor, you watch the family rise into their day, a day that will be as harsh as the night before, but one they face with the same quiet strength that carried them through the coldest hours. You stand near the hearth and listen as the cottage steadies itself into the rhythm of morning, the soft crackle of the kindling mixing with the quiet breathing of half-awake children, the shifting of straw beneath their feet, and the muffled thuds from the animals below. But outside, beyond the fragile warmth of this tiny home, the winter is waiting, vast, merciless, and impossibly cold, and the father is already stepping into it, bracing himself for the first tasks of the day. He pulls the door closed behind him with both hands, sealing the cottage back into its thin cocoon of warmth, and as he turns into the pale grey morning, he lowers his head against the sharpened air. The cold strikes him instantly. Needles in the nostrils, a tight pinch across the cheeks, a sting in the fingertips, even through wool gloves stiff with frozen sweat. His breath trails behind him in long, ghost-like ribbons, drifting into the stillness before dissolving into the dim sky. The snow under his boots is not soft. It is brittle, crusted over by the night's deeper freeze. Each step breaks the top layer with a crack, then sinks into the powder beneath with a soft sigh, the sound echoing faintly across the silent yard. This is not snow that welcomes footprints. This is snow that resists them, holding the cold like a memory. He walks toward the small well a few steps from the house. The wooden frame is coated in frost so thick it looks as though someone dipped it in glass. The rope is stiff, frozen in gentle curves, and the bucket is turned upside down, partly covered by a mound of powder that has drifted during the night. He brushes the snow from the bucket with the back of his arm, the flakes clinging stubbornly to the wool of his sleeve. You watch as he grips the handle, wincing at the cold biting through the wood. He flips the bucket upright and taps the rim lightly against the side of the well to loosen the thin ice clinging to its edges. When he lowers it, the rope creaks like an old voice waking from a long slumber, fibers groaning as frost cracks and falls in tiny white chips. The bucket drops into darkness. Then a dull splash echoes upward, the sound strangely hollow, more muted than water should sound, because the surface is partly frozen. He yanks the rope once, breaking the ice, and hauls the bucket up with slow, heavy pulls. When the bucket finally emerges, the water glitters with thin floating shards like broken glass. He tips it slightly, letting the slush spill over the rim, steam rising faintly into the cold as the warmer water beneath meets the freezing air. He stands for a moment, letting the weight rest against his thigh, gathering himself before carrying it back to the cottage. Inside, the mother has set out a small clay bowl and a wooden ladle. She moves with gentle urgency, clearing a small area of the table and placing a rag beside it to wipe the children's faces. Her fingers tremble as she works, partly from cold, partly from the endless routine of winter mornings, and the air around her carries the faint scent of damp wool warming near the hearth. As she prepares the bowl, you hear a louder vibration from beneath the floor. The animals are waking fully now, the cow stretching its legs in slow, heavy motions, the goat pawing at the hay, a chicken fluttering its wings softly as it shakes off the cold. Their warmth begins rising through the floorboards again, but the room is still too cold to feel it, the air heavy and brittle. The father returns with the bucket, boots thumping against the packed earth. The water's surface quivers with thin ice crystals that melt slowly in the firelight. She dips the ladle into it, the cold biting through the wood, and pours a small amount into the clay bowl, letting the heat of the hearth soften it before handing it to the oldest child. The child sips carefully, breath fogging above the bowl, and you watch the warm liquid soften the stiffness of their features, bringing a little colour to their cheeks. The other children wait, patient but shivering, their hands pulled into their sleeves. Outside, the father goes to the animals. You follow him into the barn-like lower level where the warmth hits you immediately. Not comfortable warmth, but earthy warmth, the kind that radiates from large bodies pressed into straw. The air smells of hay, animals, and faint ammonia, a smell strong but familiar, comforting in a way that comes only from dependence. The cow lifts her head as he enters, breath steaming in thick clouds that drift up toward the ceiling. He strokes her neck briefly, not gently, but with that practical tenderness of someone who knows exactly which creatures keep his family alive. She sways her weight as he fetches a bucket of yesterday's hay, shaking out the cold, stiff strands into the trough. The goat bleats insistently, until he scatters a handful of dry leaves and a few stored roots beside her. He checks each animal's hooves, running his fingers along the edges to ensure no ice has formed between them. Ice can cripple a goat in a single morning, and in a world where every animal counts, this simple examination becomes as vital as feeding a child. When he finishes, he kneels to gather fresh hay, but not to feed them this time. This hay is for upstairs, for the bedding. Winter night after winter night compresses the straw until it flattens beneath the bodies, losing its ability to trap warmth. He gathers a new armful and ties it loosely with twine, bits of straw clinging to his cloak as he climbs the ladder back to the cottage. Inside, the mother opens the door briefly to let him in, and the cold slashes through the room again. She closes it quickly. The children recoil, shivering, huddling near the hearth. He drops the bundle of straw beside the pallet, and together he and the mother begin lifting the blankets, letting the children step aside while they fluff and turn the bedding. The fresh straw crackles, releasing a faint sweet smell that fills the cottage with something almost pleasant. The scent of fields, harvest, warmer days long gone but not forgotten. The children help, their small hands scattering handfuls of straw evenly, their breath warming the layers as they work. Then the blankets come down again, heavy, patched, thick with the weight of necessity, and already the pallet looks more inviting, a warm island being rebuilt for the next freezing night. As the fire brightens, the mother pours a small ladle of water into a pot and places it at the edge of the hearth. Soon it will boil just enough to soften grains or dried roots, forming a thin porridge that will warm them from the inside before the family steps into the day's labor. The father steps away from the pallet, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders, and you notice frost melting on his beard, tiny droplets forming and running down toward his collar. His cloak steams slightly where snow melted against his body. The day is beginning. Slowly, coldly, but faithfully. And you feel a quiet admiration for the way this family faces it. Without complaint, without hesitation, with a calm resolve shaped by generations surviving the same unyielding winters. As the faint, colourless morning light seeps gradually into the cottage, thin as a veil, and cold as the breath of the world itself, the family begins to move in a rhythm shaped by centuries of winter survival, and the father, still stiff from the night's chill, crosses the packed earth floor toward the tools resting near the door, each one stiff with a thin crust of ice that glittered in the dim glow of the fire, and he kneels with the quiet resignation of someone who has performed these motions every day of every winter, brushing frost from wooden handles with numbed fingertips, warming the iron edges with slow, patient breaths, checking the bindings and the blade angles, as if each detail could determine whether the day ahead will be bearable or cruel, all while the cold presses through the walls in long, invisible threads that snake across the floor and crawl up his legs like silent winter spirits tracing his bones. The mother, wrapped tightly in her wool shawl, with the blanket still draped over one shoulder from sleeping, moves with a kind of soft, determined grace across the room, gathering clay bowls, coarse wooden spoons, and a small bundle of dried herbs from a shelf blackened by years of smoke, and she sets everything onto the table in a slow sequence that looks almost ceremonial, because in this world even the simplest morning tasks carry the weight of survival, and she pours the half-melted, ice-flecked water from the bucket into a small pot, holding the vessel close to the fire where the faint warmth bleeds into the clay, loosening the frozen rim, and she stirs the water with short, practiced motions, meant to coax it from shivering cold into something that can nourish their children before the day's labor begins, her breath swirling in pale clouds around her face like wandering ghosts reluctant to leave her side. The children, slower to rise but already feeling the sting of the cold along their fingers and the tips of their noses, crawl out from beneath the heavy blankets in a tangled cluster of wool, straw, and sleepy murmurs, rubbing their eyes with small fists while pressing close to each other as if unwilling to lose the warmth they built overnight, and they shuffle toward the hearth with the instinctive magnetism of creatures drawn to the only beacon of comfort in a harsh world, holding their hands out toward the small flame that wavers uncertainly, but grows a little stronger with every breath. The father feeds into it, and they stand quietly absorbing the heat that barely reaches their skin, yet still offers a kind of emotional warmth, a promise that the day will begin gently, even if the world outside offers nothing but frost. The dog rises too, shaking bits of straw from its fur and stretching its stiff legs before circling once and settling at the children's feet, its warm body becoming another soft barrier between them and the cold seeping across the floor, and the animals below stir in a slow chorus of morning murmurs, the low, rumbling exhale of the cow, the impatient bleat of the goat, the soft flutter of a chicken adjusting its perch, all of them contributing their heat to the fragile warmth climbing through the boards of the cottage like a faint, invisible tide rising against the weight of winter. Outside, the father pushes open the door just enough to step through, and a brutal blade of cold air slices into the cottage, with a force that knocks a gasp from the children, and makes the mother tighten her shawl instinctively, because the morning wind is sharper than during the night, a predatory cold that moves swiftly across exposed skin, and as the door clicks shut behind him, you feel the cottage exhale a kind of communal relief, as if the very walls recognize that the outside world has teeth. He trudges across the yard, his boots breaking through the crusted snow with sharp, brittle cracks that echo in the empty stillness, heading first toward the small shed where firewood, precious, rationed, locked in a perpetual struggle between need and scarcity, is stored under a roof thick with frost, and he checks the stack with a mixture of anxiety and resignation, counting the number of logs left, weighing in his mind how many nights remain until winter softens its grip, calculating silently how much wood he can spare for the next dusk without endangering the evenings to come, because every piece of wood is almost a living thing here, a protector of the family, a small lifeline waiting to be burned. When he returns, carrying only a few thin branches that can spare the hearth without crippling their dwindling supply, the door closes behind him again in a low, weary thud, and the family absorbs the faint warmth he brings in with his breath and his movement, and slowly, as the fire crackles more confidently, and the pot begins to emit thin trails of steam, you sense the day settling into its shape, a long series of chores, repairs, and small decisions that must all be done with careful awareness of time, resources, and cold, because in a medieval winter morning there is no luxury of ease or leisure, only the quiet, steady determination to get through the daylight hours, so that when the sun sinks and the cold returns with its full, merciless weight, the family will have a fighting chance to build warmth again from almost nothing. You settle deeper into the quiet rhythm of the morning, as the cottage slowly awakens into its daily winter choreography, and the father, still stiff from the freezing air outside, kneels once more beside the hearth, placing the thin branches gently onto the faint ember, until the flame stretches upward in a wavering line of orange that casts soft, trembling shadows across the mud and wattle walls, and you watch the heat bloom slowly, almost shyly, filling the center of the room with a fragile promise that must be tended like a newborn creature, because in a world where fuel is scarce and cold is relentless, even the smallest flame must be treated with reverence and caution. The mother, her hands red and slightly swollen from cold water and morning tasks, stirs the heating pot again, coaxing the thin broth into a warmer consistency, adding a pinch of the crushed herbs saved from late summer, herbs that release a faint aroma, something between earth and sweetness, and she leans over the pot with an expression that is both tired and soft, knowing that a cup of warm liquid in a child's stomach can make the difference between strength and sickness on a day like this, and her motions are slow and deliberate, shaped by countless mornings just like this one, where she must balance nourishment, warmth, and scarcity all at once. The children sit near the fire now, curled together like small birds perched on a branch in winter, rubbing their hands, pressing their toes deeper into the straw, the warmth of the dog at their side, giving them courage against the cold that still creeps in from every wall and every seam of the cottage. And you can hear their breaths merging into the rhythm of the house, soft puffs of fog drifting upward, like wisps of smoke as they wait for their portion of morning broth. their eyes following the steam rising from the pot with a kind of quiet anticipation that only comes from living in a world where every warm bite matters. The father rises again and crosses the room to the corner where the tools rest, each one chilled stiff from the night's frost, and he selects the heavy axe with fingers that tremble, not from fear but from the lingering numbness of cold bone and stiff joints, and he tests the blade with his thumb, feeling the small imperfections along the edge where the iron has dulled from cutting frozen wood day after day, and he knows he will spend part of the afternoon sharpening it on the grinding stone outside, even though the cold will bite his hands and make the work slow, because a dull blade in winter is not just inconvenient, it is dangerous, wasteful, and exhausting. He steps toward the door again, but before he leaves he pauses and glances back at the hearth, making sure the flame has enough life to warm the room while he works, and then he opens the door slowly to keep the wind from tearing it from his grip, and as the cold rushes in like a wave of invisible knives, the children instinctively lean closer to the fire, and the mother wraps her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and you understand now how even the simple act of opening a door becomes something cautious and deliberate in a winter like this. Outside, the father walks into a landscape drowned in silence, the snow piled high along the sides of the cottage roof, the sky pale and clouded with a soft grey light that makes everything look washed out and cold, and he trudges across the yard to the woodpile, lifting the axe over his shoulder as he prepares to split the frozen logs stacked like stiff bones beside the shed, and with each swing the sound cracks through the still morning like a snapped branch echoing across an empty forest, and you feel the force of the work ripple through your own arms as he repeats the motion again and again, splitting each piece into smaller logs that will burn faster and warmer in the small hearth. Inside, the mother pours a thin ladle of warm broth into wooden cups and hands them to the children, who hold the cups with both hands as if holding a precious treasure, sipping slowly, letting the warmth spread through their fingers and down their throats and into their chests, and the dog lifts its head to sniff the air before settling back down with a contented sigh, its breath forming small clouds that drift upward toward the rafters like tiny drifting spirits. And as the morning settles fully into its shape, you sense the rhythm of the day unfolding, a long, steady cycle of work in the cold, returning for warmth, stepping outside again, returning again, each motion quiet, deliberate, and necessary, shaped by a world where survival is measured, not in grand gestures, but in countless small acts of patience, endurance, and care that repeat day after day until winter finally loosens its grip. You watch the morning stretch itself slowly across the frozen village, and inside the cottage the last curls of steam rise from the children's wooden cups, while the mother begins clearing the small table, moving with that quiet, steady rhythm of someone who has repeated these motions through every winter of her life, her fingers lingering for a moment on the rim of each bowl, as if feeling the warmth the broth left behind, before it fades completely into the cold air that still clings stubbornly to the walls and the floor. She sets the bowls aside and pulls a bundle of coarse wool from a shelf, the fibres stiff from the cold and faintly scented with smoke. And as she begins to mend a tear in one of the children's tunics, her hands work calmly but with urgency, because every garment must hold together for as long as possible, when the wind outside can slice through fabric like a knife, and she threads her needle with slow precision, guiding it through the uneven weave in long, sweeping stitches that catch the faint light filtering through the shuttered window. The children finish their warm drink and begin the morning chores that even the youngest in a medieval home know by instinct, carrying small handfuls of straw to the animals below through the trapdoor, their breath clouding the air with each movement while the goat bleats softly in greeting and the cow exhales a warm, heavy mist that rises through the boards into the room above, a small reminder that the animal's warmth is woven into the survival of the household as deeply as the walls and the roof themselves. Outside, the father wipes sweat from his brow even though the air is still cold enough to sting, because the labor of splitting frozen wood demands every muscle in his body, and you watch him pause for a moment to stretch his aching shoulders, his breath rising in thick clouds as he surveys the winter-bitten landscape around him, the distant fields buried under snow, the trees stiff with frost, and the narrow footpaths that weave between cottages like thin threads connecting one struggling life to another, each home fighting its own battle against the cold. When he finally returns inside, carrying an armful of split wood, balanced carefully against his chest, a faint rush of warm animal-scented air greets him as he steps through the door, and he lowers the logs beside the hearth where the fire flickers with renewed strength, the flames glowing brighter as he adds each piece, their crackle filling the small room with a fragile sense of security, a reminder that warmth, even small warmth, can be made to last with careful tending and constant attention. The mother looks up from her mending and offers him a quiet nod, not a spoken word but a shared acknowledgement that the hardest parts of the morning have been managed, and for a brief moment the cottage feels almost comfortable, the fire glowing steadily, the children's soft footsteps moving between tasks, the animals below shifting in calm rhythm, and the cold held at bay just far enough to make breathing feel easy again. Soon the father crouches near the hearth and checks the tools again, selecting a smaller knife this time to scrape the ice from the water bucket, the blade ringing faintly against the frozen surface as he chips carefully along the edge, and when the ice finally cracks, he dips a ladle into the cold water and drinks with slow, deliberate gulps, his body shivering slightly as the liquid travels through him, a reminder that even the simplest acts in winter demand a kind of courage. Then he heads toward the corner where spare thatch bundles sit, waiting for repair, because the roof above, thick with frost and heavy snow, must be tended before more ice forms and causes the beams to sag dangerously, and he gathers the materials he needs, tying them together with coarse rope, while memorizing the weak points in the roof from the night before, those faint creaks that echoed through the cottage and hinted at where cold or moisture had stressed the structure most. The mother, meanwhile, finishes mending the tunic and hands it to one of the children, who slips it on gratefully and tugs the sleeves down over chilled wrists, and she then prepares a small portion of grain for the midday meal, grinding it with slow, steady motions that echo softly through the room, while the fire's glow warms her cheek and casts dancing orange shapes across her shawl. As the hours pass, the cottage settles into its daytime rhythm, the father repairing the roof outside, his silhouette moving slowly along the curve of frost-laden thatch, the children sweeping the floor with twig brooms, their feet brushing softly across the dirt, the mother tending the fire, the animals below stirring as the day warms slightly, and through it all you feel the quiet truth of medieval life, that survival in winter is not a single action, not one large effort, but a long, endless sequence of small tasks performed with patience, intention, and hope, each one carrying the weight of all the nights still to come. As the pale winter sun struggles upward through a sky washed in muted grey, the day settles into its slow, steady rhythm, and the father, balanced carefully on the icy beams of the thatched roof, works with deliberate precision, pressing handfuls of dried grasses and reeds into the weak spots where frost has eaten away at the older layers, his fingers stiffening each time the wind slides past him in long, bitter strokes. Yet he keeps working because he knows that every small repair made now spares the family from drafts that could freeze the room again when night returns with its heavy, merciless darkness. Inside the cottage, the mother sweeps the floor with a broom made from stiff bundled twigs, brushing aside bits of straw, ash, and loose dirt with soft rhythmic strokes that echo gently around the room, and every few motions she pauses to rub warmth into her fingers, pressing her hands together until the blood tingles beneath her skin, because the cold inside the cottage still lingers like a stubborn shadow, retreating slowly but never fully surrendering even in daylight. The children follow her path, gathering the bits of debris into a small clay bowl that will later be carried outside, their small hands working earnestly as they mimic the tasks they have watched their parents perform 1,000 times. The animals below the floor begin their daytime stirring, the cow shifting her weight, and letting out a slow, heavy exhale that warms the space just enough to soften the boards overhead. And the goat moves in small, impatient circles before settling into her hay again, her warmth rising in gentle waves through the cracks in the wood, becoming part of the cottage's quiet defense against the cold, a kind of living insulation that hums beneath the family's feet. Every so often the children pause to listen to the noises below, smiling faintly as they hear familiar sounds drifting upward, the soft crunch of hay, the low murmur of breath, the small hoof against wood. By midday, the mother places a pot of grain and winter root mash near the edge of the hearth, letting the fire's low flames slowly transform the hard, cold ingredients into something edible, and she sprinkles crushed herbs on top, not for flavor, though flavor is scarce, but because the plants were gathered in warmer months specifically to ward off winter aches and coughing. And as she stirs, the steam begins to rise in thin white ribbons, carrying a faint scent that feels like a distant memory of summer fields, a fragile comfort she shares with the family in small portions that warm their stomachs more than their tongues. The father returns briefly from his work on the roof, his boots caked with frozen mud, and his breath forming clouds that drift around him like pale smoke, and he steps inside only long enough to warm his hands by the hearth, rubbing them together until the skin softens, the joints loosen, and the ache in his fingertips eases just enough for him to lift the next bundle of thatch without fear of dropping it. He gives the mother a quick, tired nod as she hands him a small wooden cup of warm mash, and he drinks it in slow sips before heading back out into the cold, with a kind of determined patience that speaks of long winters endured and longer ones still remembered. The children eat more quickly, their hands cupped around their bowls as they sit cross-legged near the fire, letting the warmth from both flame and food seep into their chests, while they chatter quietly about simple things, the shape of the frost on the window, the way the wind whistled earlier through a loose board, the sound of the goat below, their voices soft enough not to disturb the fragile peace of the cottage, yet bright enough to fill the cold air with a thread of gentle life that weaves through the room like a small, comforting song. After the meal, the mother guides the children through their afternoon chores, sending one outside to gather more snow for melting, while the others bring bundles of firewood closer to the hearth, stacking the pieces carefully so that the driest ones lie nearest the flame for later use, their breath trailing behind them as they work. She then turns to the day's longer task, repairing their winter garments, spreading the worn tunics and hose across her lap in the weak daylight and stitching new patches along the elbows, knees and edges with slow, practiced motions that keep cloth from fraying further, because even a small tear left unattended could invite the cold inside and make the night unbearably sharp. Outside, the father finishes reinforcing the roof and climbs down with slow, cautious steps, planting his boots firmly in the snow before lifting the ladder and leaning it against the side of the house for the next repair. And as he does, the wind sweeps across the fields in long, mournful breaths that carry flecks of ice along their path, rattling the cottage shutters like distant thunder, and reminding him that daylight is short and dusk comes early in winter, giving him only a handful of hours to prepare the family for another night, where the cold tests every decision they make. He brings in another load of wood, smaller pieces for quick burning, and a few thicker logs for keeping the embers warm through the dusk hours, and he sets them beside the hearth with quiet consideration, glancing at the mother's slow stitching and the children's bundled chores, the small fire that still burns in steady orange pulses, and the thin frost creeping again along the lowest edge of the shuttered window, and he begins planning the rest of the afternoon in his mind, determining how much wood they can burn safely, how soon to heat stones for the bedding, when to check on the animals again, and how to ration the grain so that the evening meal fills the children, but still leaves enough for tomorrow. The day moves with a soft, snow-muted quality, each hour passing like a long exhale, and you begin to sense how the rhythm of medieval winter life is not defined by urgency, but by endurance, by quiet persistence, and by a steady awareness of how quickly light fades, and how deeply cold settles when the sun sinks behind the frozen fields. The family works not in haste but in careful preparation, knowing that the warmth they build now will carry them into the long, dark stretch of night that waits patiently beyond the horizon. As the weak winter sun drifts lower in the sky, its pale light thinning until it looks more like a fading memory than a source of warmth, the cottage begins its slow, instinctive shift into late afternoon preparation. That quiet period when every movement, every stitch, every footstep, every small choice bends toward the single purpose of creating enough warmth, enough order, enough readiness to endure another night that will soon press against the walls with its vast frozen patience. The mother, still seated near the hearth where the fire flickers in gentle, steady breaths, completes the last row of stitches on a child's tunic and folds the garment neatly before setting it aside, and then she reaches for a stack of coarse wool blankets piled in the corner, shaking each one lightly to loosen the straw caught inside, and laying them across the raised sleeping platform in slow, careful layers, creating a thick, uneven nest where warmth can collect and linger long after the fire has dimmed into a soft, red heartbeat beneath the ash. With each blanket she smooths the surface with her palm as if soothing the fabric itself into readiness for the cold ahead. Meanwhile the children carry small stones, warmed briefly near the fire and wrapped in scraps of cloth toward the bedding, placing them at the feet of the blankets where the heat will spread slowly through straw and wool. And though the warmth they carry is faint and fleeting, the children handle each stone with quiet reverence, aware from experience that even a small reserve of heat can be the difference between a night that gnaws at their bones and one that lets them fall asleep without shivering awake in the dark. Below the floor, the animals shift as the day grows colder, the cow letting out a long, low breath that vibrates gently through the wooden planks, while the goat paws lightly at her hay, as if seeking a more comfortable place to settle for the coming night. Their warmth rises through the boards in soft, invisible waves, and the family above listens for these familiar sounds, not out of worry but out of comfort, because the subtle murmur of animals moving in the dark is a promise that the cottage will hold a bit more warmth when the last light disappears. Outside, the father finishes securing the woodpile, brushing snow from the top of the stack and arranging the logs according to size, thin kindling in one bundle, thicker branches in another, and the heaviest pieces placed at the back for the deepest hours of night, when the embers begin to fade and the room needs one long, slow-burning log to keep the cold from creeping relentlessly toward the sleeping platform. He pauses often to rub his hands together, his breath hanging in the air like a small cloud before the wind sweeps it away, and although the day has drained much of the strength from his muscles, he carries himself with that quiet, enduring steadiness, born from many winters lived in this same fragile balance between cold and comfort. When he steps back inside, closing the door quickly to keep the wind from slipping in behind him, he brings with him a gust of cold that brushes the children's ankles and makes the dog shuffle closer to the fire, and he sets the final load of wood beside the hearth with a soft, deliberate thud, glancing at the mother's careful arrangement of blankets, the children's warmed stones tucked beneath the wool, the faint glow of the fire that flickers against the soot-darkened rafters, and he nods again, an unspoken acknowledgement that everything is falling into place as it should. The mother begins preparing the evening meal, pouring thin grain into the pot, and adding a handful of dried cabbage leaves saved from late autumn, stirring the mixture until it thickens slowly into a simple winter stew, and the scent, modest but comforting, spreads through the cottage like a soft, warm veil, mingling with the smell of wool, smoke, and earth, in a way that makes the small home feel momentarily full, almost abundant, despite the scarcity of ingredients. She lifts the wooden spoon and taps it gently against the pot's rim, a slow rhythmic sound that blends with the creaks of the roof and the murmurs of the animals in a quiet symphony of evening. The children, sensing night's approach, instinctively draw closer to the hearth, their shoulders touching, their movements smaller and slower now as if the cold outside has begun to seep into their limbs even before the sun disappears. One child folds small bundles of moss. They will later stuff into tiny cracks along the window frame. Another arranges the shoes near the wall to dry from the morning snow, and the youngest curls beside the dog, running fingers through its fur, while whispering something soft and drowsy that only the animal seems to understand. The father kneels by the hearth and places one of the thicker logs on top of the glowing embers, watching the flame hesitate, before finally licking upward along the rough bark, and he adjusts the position of the log with a long iron poker, coaxing it into a place where it will burn slow and steady, the firelight painting his face in warm gold that softens the lines of fatigue, etched deeply into his forehead. He sits back for a moment, stretching his legs toward the flame, and the warmth climbs gradually into his boots, a small luxury in a world where comfort is carved out of effort rather than abundance. As the last thin threads of daylight slip away from the shuttered window, the cottage grows dim except for the fire's glow, which now becomes the heart of the room, beating in slow pulses of amber and red, and you can feel the entire family leaning into that warmth, not physically, though they do gather around it, but spiritually, as if the fire is a companion that will keep watch while they sleep, a fragile protector whose survival depends entirely on their care and attention. The mother ladles portions of stew into simple clay bowls and hands them out one by one, the children cradling the bowls in their palms to feel the heat seep into their fingers, and the family eats in slow, thoughtful bites, letting the warmth settle gently into their stomachs while the room fills with the soft sounds of quiet chewing, the rustle of wool, the occasional crackle of firewood, and the distant muffled groan of winter wind sliding along the outer walls as it prepares to reclaim the night. And as evening drapes itself fully across the world outside, the family begins the final preparations for sleep, packing moss into the last stubborn cracks, tightening the shutters, adjusting the blankets, checking the warm stones, stirring the embers into a small protective glow, each action performed with a slow, practiced gentleness that feels almost ritualistic, as if they are not simply readying their home, but inviting it to breathe with them through another long, cold night, where warmth will depend not on luxury, but on closeness, patience, and the quiet strength of shared endurance. As the last traces of evening fade and the cottage settles into a deeper, more intimate quiet, the family moves with the soft, deliberate slowness of people who understand that the night requires careful preparation, not haste, and the mother begins by gently lowering the pot away from the hearth, so the remaining warmth can linger without burning too quickly, her hands steady as she places a wooden lid over the top, knowing that even a spoonful saved for morning can soften the sting of waking in a room colder than breath itself. The father kneels beside the fire pit and stirs the embers with a thin iron rod, coaxing the glowing heart of the flame into a small, concentrated cluster that will last as long as possible without devouring the precious wood they must conserve for the coming days. He carefully arranges thin layers of ash over the brightest ember, dimming it just enough that it will sleep without dying, and as he blows softly across its surface, the tiny spark pulses like a tired eye, a living fragment of heat that will guide them into dawn if tended with respect. The children gather near the sleeping platform as the mother begins arranging the blankets into a single broad nest, her motions slow and practiced as she tucks the edges beneath the straw, smooths the wrinkles with her palms, and checks the warm stones placed at the foot of the bedding, adjusting their cloth wrappings to ensure the heat remains trapped inside as long as possible, because these stones, faintly warm, barely radiating, will make the first hour of sleep bearable before the cold returns to claim every inch of space not protected by bodies and wool. Below the floor, the animals grow quiet, their earlier shifting replaced by the slow, rhythmic sounds of nighttime settling. The cow's deep exhale, the faint rustle of hay as the goat curls down into her nest, the soft cluck of a chicken adjusting its feathers, each noise rising through the floorboards in gentle vibrations that soothe the room like a distant heartbeat, reminding the family that they are not alone in the darkness but cradled above living warmth that hums beneath them like a quiet promise. The father checks the door one last time, pressing his palm against the wood to feel for drafts, tightening the cloth stuffed beneath the threshold, adjusting the latch so the wind cannot force it open. And when he steps back, the room feels smaller, more contained, as if the cottage itself has pulled its walls closer to protect the family from the bitter, starless cold spreading across the world outside like a silent tide of ice. The mother dims the final flicker of lamplight, and for a long moment the only illumination in the cottage is the glow of the embers, soft, red, pulsing gently, casting long shadows that sway across the walls like drifting ghosts, and the children pause to watch it, mesmerized by the warmth and the quiet, as if the hypnotic faint glow is telling them without words that night has begun its slow descent, and that sleep is waiting just beyond the edge of wakefulness. Then the family crawls into the bedding together, each movement careful and aware of the cold that waits just outside the blankets, and the children settle at the center where warmth collects most easily, curling their bodies together like small woodland creatures in a burrow, while the mother and father position themselves along the outer edges, forming a protective barrier between the drafts creeping in from the walls and the tender warmth of their sleeping children, using their own bodies as shields against the long, frozen hours ahead. The blankets rustle softly as they pull them higher, the coarse wool scraping lightly against skin, the scent of lanolin rising faintly, mingling with the earthy smell of straw and the lingering trace of herbs hung hours earlier near the rafters. You can hear the children exhale, long and slow, letting the last of the day soften inside their chests as they nestle deeper into the warmth of the huddle, their small hands sliding beneath layers to find each other's fingers, creating a tiny pocket of shared heat. As the night deepens, the cold begins to seep into the cottage with calculated patience, slipping along the floor, crawling up the walls, threading itself through every seam in the shutters, and touching the edges of the blankets like a quiet intruder searching for entry. But the warmth gathered in the center of the bedding pushes back, not with force but with persistence, a gentle resistance built from shared breath and resting bodies, and the slow radiation of heat trapped beneath wool. The father shifts once, settling his shoulder against the wall to block a faint icy draft that breathes through a crack near the edge of the timber frame, and the cold touches him like a thin blade, sharp and immediate, but he exhales evenly and rests his hand over the blanket that covers his children, his body absorbing the worst of the chill so it cannot slip inward toward them. He closes his eyes with the disciplined calm of someone who has endured countless nights, just like this, letting the sound of their breathing wash over him in slow, comforting waves. The house creaks softly as the temperature drops further, the beams contracting in long, quiet sighs, the thatch above settling more firmly as frost spreads across its surface like delicate white lace, forming intricate patterns that shimmer faintly in the moonless dark. The sound is not frightening but familiar, the voice of the cottage adjusting to winter's weight, the same creaks and whispers that have lulled generations of sleepers into rest. Inside the bedding nest, the air grows warm from accumulated breath, a fragile bubble of life suspended in a sea of cold, and the children begin to drift towards sleep with slow, uneven breaths, their eyelids heavy, their limbs softening into stillness, and one child murmurs something faint and dreamy before slipping fully into slumber, the words dissolving into the quiet as quickly as they form. The mother rests her cheek against the blanket, her hair brushing softly across the wool as she listens to the slowing rhythm of her children's breathing, feeling the warmth from their bodies seep through the layers into her own chilled skin, her thoughts wandering gently across memories of winters past, of nights she endured before she had children to warm, of the long, silent hours when she lay awake, listening to the same wind whispering against the same walls. And now she feels the bittersweet comfort of knowing that she protects and is protected in return, part of a single huddle of warmth in a world that grows colder with every passing minute. The fire in the hearth sinks gradually into a faint red glow, no longer a flame but an ember cluster that breathes in quiet pulses, illuminating the room just enough to paint soft outlines of the sleeping figures. a dim reminder that warmth remains even in stillness. The shadows lengthen and soften until the cottage feels like a world wrapped in dusk, suspended between silence and breath. And the cold outside presses closer with each hour, but cannot breach the core of warmth that the family has built through their closeness, their patience, and their nightly rituals. And as the long medieval night deepens, stretching slowly across the hours with heavy silence and patient frost, the family drifts together through the first phase of sleep, their bodies bundled, their breaths synchronized, their warmth pooled in the center of the bedding like a small beacon glowing in the dark, waiting for the inevitable moment. Hours from now, when they will stir, half wake, whisper, shift, and then slip together into their second sleep, continuing the ancient rhythm that has carried families through winter nights for centuries. If you want, I can continue with the midnight interval, the soft waking, the tending of embers, the whispering in the dark, the return to second sleep, or carry the story gently into the fragile dawn, all in the same long, flowing, sleepy tone. The night stretches deeper, settling over the cottage like a vast, heavy blanket of silence, and for a long while the only sounds are the slow breaths of the sleeping family and the faint animal murmurs drifting upward from the dark space below. But as the hours pass and the cold tightens its grip around the walls, something subtle begins to shift. Not a noise loud enough to wake anyone fully, but a gentle stirring that moves through the bedding like a ripple of warm air brushing against colder stillness. And gradually the family enters that ancient interval between the first and second sleep, a quiet floating state known only to those who live in worlds guided by the rhythm of long winter nights. The father is the first to stir, feeling the numbness creeping along his arm where the draft from the wall has pressed against him for hours, and he shifts slightly, rolling his shoulder inward to block the chill more effectively, his movements slow and careful, so as not to disturb the children pressed warmly at the center of the bedding. He exhales, a deep, tired breath that releases a faint cloud into the cold air above him, and for a moment he lies awake in that half-conscious drift, neither fully alert nor fully asleep, simply listening to the quiet hum of the cottage, settling deeper into the night. The mother awakens moments later, not from discomfort, but from the natural rhythm that draws her gently upward from dreams, and she opens her eyes to the dim red light of the embers glowing faintly through the hearth ash, their light pulsing in delicate intervals like distant stars glimpsed through clouds. She listens to the soft breathing around her, the children nestled closely together, the father's steady exhales, the small sigh of the dog curled near their feet, and she feels an old, familiar calm settle into her chest. The warmth is holding, the cold has not yet crept into the heart of the bedding, and for now that is enough. One of the children shifts in their sleep, letting out a tiny whimper, a small dream-born sound, and instinctively the mother reaches across the blanket, placing her hand near the child's shoulder, not waking them but offering a silent reassurance that they are safe, that warmth surrounds them. That night may be long, but they are not alone within it. The child exhales softly and settles again, their breathing returning to the slow rhythmic pattern of deep first sleep, transitioning into wakeful drifting. The cottage creaks gently as the temperature outside drops lower still, the beams contracting with that ancient winter voice that has echoed through countless nights like this. And the father, half awake now, listens to the structure shift around them, recognizing the subtle sounds that tell him where frost has formed, where wind has pressed hardest against the outer wall, where snow has begun to pile more heavily on the roof. These are not noises that frighten him, but ones that inform him, teaching him in silence how the house is holding up against the cold. After several minutes of quiet stillness, the mother lifts her head slightly, her hair brushing against the rough wool of the blanket, and she turns her gaze toward the hearth, noticing how the embers have dimmed into a soft, low glow that barely illuminates the edges of the room. She knows that if they fall asleep again without tending it, the ember might fade completely, leaving them to wake in the brittle, breath-stealing cold of dawn, with no warmth to coax the fire back to life. And so she slowly eases herself out of the bedding, with the delicate precision of someone who has done this more nights than she can count. She moves quietly across the floor, her feet touching the cold earth with a small shiver that climbs up her legs and into her spine, but she keeps her pace steady, kneeling beside the hearth and using the long iron rod to shift the ash gently until she reveals the small, glowing core beneath. She blows softly, sending a faint stream of warm breath over the ember, coaxing it into a slightly brighter glow, not enough to spark flames, but enough to ensure that life remains in its tiny red center, that the ember will endure until morning, when the fire must be urged back into full strength. The faint light from the hearth casts long, wavering shadows across the room, gliding over the rafters, the patched walls, the bundles of herbs hanging near the ceiling, and the sleeping shapes on the bedding, and in that moment the cottage feels like a quiet world suspended in darkness, held together by breath, warmth, and the fragile glow of one ember preserved through the long cold night. As the mother returns to the bedding, tucking herself gently back into the nest of warmth, the father murmurs something soft, not words formed fully, but the sound of a voice rising out of sleep, checking without waking, making sure she has returned safely, before his mind drifts again into the quiet darkness between sleep and wakefulness. She touches his arm lightly, and he exhales a warmer, calmer breath, sinking back into the drowsy quiet of the night's midpoint. The children, stirred only faintly by the shifting of warmth as their parents moved, nestle deeper into the blankets, pulling their legs closer to their chests, their small bodies radiating heat into the shared space, and the dog shifts with them, pressing its side against the nearest child, adding its own warmth to the cluster in a gesture as instinctive as breathing. Outside the wind rises, dragging its frozen fingers along the shutters with a low moan that resonates faintly through the walls, but inside the cottage the sound is softened by layers of wool, straw, and tired breath, becoming less a threat and more a reminder of the world held at bay, a distant presence that circles the home but cannot quite reach its inner warmth. And slowly, as the embers glow steady under their blanket of ash, and the warmth gathered in the bedding begins to expand again, the family drifts together back into the second sleep, the deeper, heavier rest that follows the quiet interval, the kind that sinks into the bones like slow warmth, carrying them gently through the remaining hours of the night, while the cold outside deepens, the frost thickens, and the world grows still enough to hear the faint settling of snow on the roof above. The cottage settles once more into silence, as the family drifts into the deep second sleep, that heavier, dream-thick rest that comes only after the quiet waking interval has passed, and the warmth that has pooled beneath the blankets begins to thicken into a soft, enveloping cocoon of breath and shared heat, a small pocket of life suspended in a vast sea of winter cold, pressing patiently against the walls. The children sink first, their small bodies releasing the last traces of tension as they curl deeper into the warmth, their breaths deepening until each exhale becomes a soft rhythmic rise of steam slipping through the weave of the wool blankets, and their dreams, warm, shifting things shaped by flickers of firelight and the muffled comfort of animal sounds below, wrap around them like another invisible layer of protection, helping their bodies forget for a while the cold waiting just inches beyond the bedding's edge. The mother, now fully returned to the warmth beside the children, lets her eyelids fall again, the fatigue of the day settling heavily along her shoulders and back. But in this deeper sleep she no longer wakes at every shift or faint creak of the house. Instead she drifts into a slow, weighted slumber that feels like sinking into soft earth. After a long journey, the warmth of her children pressed against her spine, acting as an anchor that keeps her from rising fully to the surface, even when the wind groans outside or a plank adjusts beneath her. The father follows last, his body still half listening, an old habit, sharpened by winters when he had to wake quickly to check the fire or quiet an anxious animal. But as the minutes pass, he too melts deeper into the huddle, his breath slowing into a steady, almost meditative rhythm as the warmth from the bedding finally reaches his chilled limbs, and the ache in his shoulders unwinds, just enough for him to slip into dreams shaped by memories of warmer seasons, green fields, and long-forgotten summers that return quietly in winter sleep. The cold outside continues its silent advance, creeping up the walls and across the floorboards with the patient relentlessness of something that does not hurry because it knows it cannot be fought, only endured. And frost forms along the bottom edges of the shutters in delicate white filigree patterns that glisten faintly, even in the near darkness. The draught beneath the door, once blocked by cloth, begins to push faint tendrils of icy air into the room again, curling along the floor like a pale, silent mist, seeking any weakness in the patchwork defenses the family has built. But the warmth of the sleeping huddle holds strong, forming its own small weather within the blankets, a climate entirely separate from the frozen world outside. The air trapped beneath the layers of wool is humid, warm, dense with shared breath, and when one child shifts, the warmth spreads in small ripples, touching each body in turn, reinforcing the fragile bubble of heat the family has created through closeness rather than fuel. Below the floor, the animals sleep deeply as well, their own breaths slow and steady, and their warmth rises through the planks in faint, comforting waves, a gentle countercurrent to the cold pressing down from above. The cow's large body radiates heat like a slow-burning furnace, steady and reliable, while the goat's small adjustments send tiny vibrations through the floor that pass beneath the family like soothing, instinctive reassurance, a reminder that life surrounds them even in the darkest hours. Inside the cottage, the ember cluster in the hearth glows faintly beneath its blanket of ash, a dim red heart that pulses with slow, sleepy breaths, its light so soft that it barely touches the walls, but still enough to keep the darkness from being absolute. Occasionally a faint crackle escapes into the stillness, a tiny spark shifting or a piece of ash collapsing inward, and each sound echoes gently through the quiet, like a whisper from the fire itself, promising that warmth still lives, however small. Hours pass in this enveloping quiet, the deep second sleep drawing the family into its slow restorative tide, and outside the world grows even colder, the wind sharpening into thin, icy threads that lash against the roof and walls, the snow settling more heavily onto the cottage in thick, muffling layers that insulate sound and deepen the silence inside until it feels like the entire world has narrowed to the small circle of bodies, breathing in unison under a patchwork of blankets. As the night presses toward its coldest point, that hour before dawn when winter bares its teeth most fiercely, the air inside the cottage grows sharper, thinner, and more brittle, the cold creeping up through the floorboards in spite of the animals' warmth, slipping into cracks that were sealed earlier, but now strain under the pressure of freezing temperatures. Frost begins to form along the edges of the bedding itself, delicate white crystals catching the faint ember glow as they cling to the outermost layers of wool. Yet even as the temperature drops to its lowest, the family sleeps on, buffered by their shared heat and the deep stillness of second sleep, their bodies folded into one another in a way that seems almost instinctive, as if generations of winter nights have taught them how to align themselves so that warmth is distributed naturally, evenly, and gently through the shared nest that protects them better than any fire could during this darkest hour. The father's hand rests near the child beside him, his fingers curled loosely in half-sleep, and the child's small foot presses lightly against his leg, the warmth passing between them like a silent promise. The mother's breath slows into a deep rhythmic flow, her chest rising and falling against the soft fabric of the blankets, creating tiny currents of warmth that drift toward the children's backs. The youngest curls more tightly into the nest, drawing the blanket higher until only a small patch of hair peeks out, glinting faintly in the ember light like a sliver of gold. Outside, the wind's voice rises once more, lifting spirals of snow into the air, and pressing against the shutters with low, hollow moans that vibrate faintly through the walls. But inside the cottage, these sounds transform into a soft lullaby, a distant reminder of the storm held at bay by mud walls, wooden beams, stitched blankets, and the quiet strength of bodies gathered under the weight of winter's longest hours. And slowly, with no exact moment marking the transition, the coldest part of the night begins to pass. The darkness releases a fraction of its grip, and somewhere beneath the horizon the first suggestion of dawn stirs. Not light, not warmth, but a subtle easing in the air, a thinning of the night's heavy silence that signals the beginning of another fragile morning waiting to form. The night begins its slow retreat almost imperceptibly, long before light appears, long before warmth even tries to return, and the first sign that dawn approaches is not brightness but a subtle loosening, a faint softening in the suffocating stillness that has pressed against the cottage for hours, as if the darkness itself is exhaling after holding its breath through the coldest part of the night. The frost along the shuttered window thickens into delicate crystalline lace, its white edges glowing faintly with the ember's soft sleepy pulse, and tiny glittering points shimmer each time the wind outside shifts and brushes snow against the wooden frame. The air within the room grows even thinner, as the last of the night's cold tries to settle itself across the floor, creeping upward toward the bedding, like an invisible tide reaching for the warmth it has been denied. One of the children stirs first, not fully waking but shifting in a dreamy half-motion, pulling their knees closer to their chest, as a thin curl of cold slips across the edge of the blanket and brushes against their ankle. The child burrows deeper into the nest without opening their eyes, their small movement sending ripples of warmth outward through the huddle, prompting a sleepy murmur from a sibling and a soft sigh from the mother, who remains wrapped in the deep quiet of second sleep even as her body registers the slight change in temperature. The father lies still but no longer deeply asleep, his instincts sharpened by decades of winter nights that taught him to notice even the smallest shift in the air. He moves one hand just enough to press the blanket more firmly around the children at the center, sealing the warmth inside, and his fingers brush against the wool in slow, steady motions, until he feels the heat settle again beneath the layers. Only then does he allow his breathing to deepen once more into the slow, protective cadence of sleep that carries him through the final stretch of night. Below the floor, the animals begin their own faint stirring, a gentle rustling of hay and a few low, sleepy grunts rising up through the boards. The cow gives a long exhale that vibrates through the wood like a warm sigh, and the goat shifts her weight with a soft thump, both movements marking the transition into the hour when creatures, even in deepest winter, begin to sense that the night is thinning and that another day, however cold, waits just beyond the horizon. The ember in the hearth, hidden beneath its layer of ash, pulses weakly like a tiny heartbeat struggling against the cold, and occasionally a faint glow brightens for a moment before dimming again, signaling that its life is fragile but not yet lost. A thin thread of warmth rises from it, barely enough to warm the air but enough to remind the house that fire still lives. That morning will not begin in complete darkness if someone tends it in time. The cottage creaks again as the beams contract one last time under the tightening cold, and the sound echoes through the rafters with a soft, hollow groan that blends with the distant moan of winter wind outside. Yet even as these noises ripple through the room, they feel more like familiar companions than threats, a nightly chorus that marks the passage of hours in a world where darkness and light follow ancient, unhurried rhythms. Gradually, a thin, colourless glow seeps into the edges of the shuttered window, not warm, not bright, but a pale suggestion of light trying to find its way through the frost, and with it comes the faintest shift in the air, a slight easing of the cold's weight, as dawn pushes gently against the night, not with force but with slow, persistent patience. The mother is the first to respond to this change, her breath catching slightly as the air brushes against her cheeks in a different, almost fragile way. She opens her eyes halfway, not fully awake but rising into that gentle space between dreaming and awareness, and she listens, really listens, to the silence around her, to the breathing of her children, to the low vibrations from the animals below, to the subtle movements of the cold as it begins to release its grip. She lifts her head just enough to look toward the hearth, noticing how the faintest trace of pale dawn seeps along the edges of the room, and she knows, with the deep, ingrained certainty of someone who has lived many winters, that it is time to rise, time to coax the ember back to life, before the cold of morning sinks even deeper into the cottage and steals the fragile warmth the family has fought to gather during the night. Carefully, with slow, deliberate motions that do not disturb the children nestled in the center of the bedding, she pulls herself free from the nest of blankets, and the cold greets her instantly, brushing against her skin in a sharp, almost metallic wave that tightens her breath. But she continues anyway, her bare feet touching the chilled earth floor with a soft crunch of frost as she moves toward the hearth. She kneels beside it and brushes aside the ash with gentle strokes of the iron rod, revealing the small glowing ember beneath, faint, tired, but alive. And she leans close, her breath fogging the air as she blows softly, coaxing the ember into a brighter glow, feeding it with a few thin twigs she gathered the night before, and slowly, with patience shaped by countless dawns, the ember brightens into a soft flicker of flame that begins to warm the air around her hands. As the tiny flame stretches and curls upward, sending a faint, warm pulse through the cottage, the father stirs fully awake, lifting his head from the blankets with a slow, weary motion, and he looks toward the hearth with gratitude so quiet it remains unspoken. He rises from the bedding, wraps his cloak around his shoulders to block the morning drafts, and joins the mother by the fire, adding a small piece of wood to help the flame build strength for the day ahead. The children begin to wake as well, not with sudden movements but with small shifts. A hand curling tighter around the blanket, a foot stretching toward a warm stone now cooled to faint warmth, a sleepy blinking of eyes searching for the firelight, and one by one they sit up, rubbing their faces with cold hands and leaning toward the hearth where the flame now breathes steadily, offering the first fragile promise of warmth for the new day. Outside, the sky brightens with the pale, distant light of a winter dawn, and the wind softens into a slow whisper that brushes snow gently from the roof, and the world begins once more, cold, harsh, demanding. But inside the small cottage the flame grows stronger, the blankets hold their lingering warmth, the animals stir beneath the floor, and the family gathers close, ready to rise into another day shaped by endurance, by routine, and by the quiet, unwavering determination to survive winter one dawn at a time. The pale winter dawn settles slowly over the cottage, not with warmth or brightness, but with a thin grey illumination that gently reveals the outlines of the room, the bundled blankets still holding traces of the night's heat, the low rafters darkened by smoke, the clay pots stacked neatly against the wall, and the faint shimmer of frost clinging to the shutters like delicate white feathers. And as the new day unfolds in this fragile half-light, the family begins the slow instinctive motion of returning fully to wakefulness, guided more by necessity than by choice. The mother, now kneeling near the small flame that she coaxed back to life, adds a few slender pieces of wood one at a time, waiting for each to catch before placing the next, her hands steady despite the cold that still nips sharply at her fingers, and the fire responds with soft crackles, stretching upward with renewed energy, casting warm orange flickers across her cheeks and creating long, trembling shadows that sway gently along the walls with every movement of the flame. The father rises from the bedding with the stiffness of a man who has spent the night fighting drafts and cold with his own body, and he pauses for a moment beside the sleeping platform, rubbing warmth into his arms and legs while watching the fire grow stronger, its glow spreading slowly across the room like a small sun returning to a world that has forgotten what warmth feels like. He inhales deeply, letting the warmth touch his face, and then he turns toward the trapdoor leading to the animals below. When he lifts the wooden panel, a wave of warm, earthy air rises from the lower level, filled with the scents of hay, animal breath, and the faint musk of wool and straw, and he descends the ladder with slow, careful steps, the dim morning light following behind him as the animals stir more fully, the cow letting out a deep, low groan as she shifts her weight, the goat shaking frost-dusted straw from her back, the chickens shuffling in their roost with soft, sleepy clucks that echo faintly in the enclosed space. He moves through the lower room with gentle familiarity, patting the cow's flank, checking the goat's tether, ensuring the animals have hay to eat and fresh water, though fresh means breaking the thin crust of ice that formed overnight on the surface of the bucket, and each movement is accompanied by the soft rustling of straw beneath his boots, and the steady breathing of creatures who rely on him to keep the cold from claiming them as easily as it could claim the humans above. Upstairs, the children sit closer to the hearth now, their faces bathed in the growing firelight, rubbing their hands together and holding them toward the flame, their fingers still stiff from the cold, but slowly loosening as the warmth begins to spread into their palms. Their hair is tousled from sleep, their cheeks slightly flushed, their breaths visible in the chilly air of the room, and they speak in soft whispers, exchanging sleepy murmurs about dreams and the sounds they heard during the darkest hours of the night. The mother moves between tasks with a calm, steady grace, checking the pot of leftover stew from the night before, adding a handful of water to thin it, and placing it near the fire to warm, the steam rising slowly in pale curls that add moisture to the otherwise dry, cold air. She stirs the pot with long, slow strokes of the wooden spoon, sending small waves across the surface, and the scent, modest but comforting, begins to drift into the corners of the room, signaling the promise of a simple but warming breakfast. As the fire grows stronger, the frost on the shuttered window begins to melt at the edges, creating small, clear patches through which the outside world becomes visible. White drifts piled along the edges of the cottage, the snow-covered ground stretching into the distance, the faint outline of neighboring homes also stirring awake as thin trails of smoke rise from roofs like grey ribbons curling into the still morning air. The father climbs back up the ladder, brushing hay from his coat, and he closes the trapdoor behind him, sealing the last of the animal warmth below, but carrying some of it with him in the scent that clings to his clothes. He joins the mother by the fire, helping her lift the pot for a moment, so she can place thicker logs beneath the flame before setting it back down with a soft thud, and together they share a brief, quiet glance, a moment of gratitude exchanged without words, simply acknowledging that another night has been survived. The children gather around the small wooden table as the mother ladles the warmed stew into bowls, each of them cupping the vessel carefully to feel the heat seep into their hands and chests, and the father joins them, sitting on a stool he carved years ago from a fallen tree, its surface worn smooth by countless mornings just like this one. The family eats slowly, savouring each bite as it spreads warmth through their bodies, preparing them for the cold outside they must face again. When breakfast is finished, the mother rinses the bowls with a handful of warmed water, scrubbing them clean before setting them aside, and the children begin putting on their outer layers, wool tunics, patched shawls, stiff leather shoes, each piece of clothing functional rather than comfortable, meant to protect them from the chill rather than make them feel at ease. The father tightens the straps of his boots, checks his tools, and prepares to step outside to begin the day's labour, knowing the sun offers little warmth even at its peak. As he opens the door, a breath of icy wind enters the cottage, causing the children to huddle instinctively closer to the fire and the mother to pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The world outside greets them with silent fields blanketed in white, the footprints from yesterday nearly erased by fresh snow, the air crisp and sharp enough that each inhale feels like swallowing cold iron, and yet there is a quiet beauty in the stillness, a rare calm that only deep winter can bring. The father steps out into the pale morning, his boots crunching through the fresh layer of snow, and he heads toward the woodpile and the tasks awaiting him, his breath rising in slow white clouds that fade into the air as he moves. The mother closes the door gently behind him, preserving the warmth inside, and the children begin their indoor chores while the fire continues to grow, its glow reaching higher, pushing back the cold that presses from every side. And so another day begins, not with comfort or ease, but with the steady, enduring rhythm of a family that has learned to meet winter with quiet resilience, carrying the warmth of their shared night into the fragile light of morning. As the pale morning deepens and the family settles into the rhythm of its daily chores, the sun climbs only a little above the horizon, its weak light glimmering across the frozen village like a thin veil stretched over the earth, and the cold air remains sharp enough to sting the skin, reminding everyone that even though a new day has begun, winter has not loosened its grip for even a moment. The father works steadily outside, his boots sinking through the snow with every step as he chops wood, checks the roof for new frost damage, and clears a thin path around the cottage so the next snowfall does not bury the doorway completely. Each swing of his axe sends a crack echoing through the still morning air, a sound that blends with the occasional bark of a distant dog or the muffled voices of other villagers beginning their own routines, creating a faint chorus of life struggling steadily against the freeze. Inside, the mother tends to the hearth, feeding the fire with careful precision to stretch every piece of wood as far as possible, and she hums softly under her breath, not a song with words but a low, soothing melody that seems to warm the room as much as the fire does, a rhythm passed from her mother before her, and likely from her grandmother before that. An old winter lullaby meant to calm restless spirits during long cold seasons. The children listen quietly as they sweep the floor, carry warm water to the animals, and mend small tears in their own clothing, their movements gentle and focused. By midday, the faint warmth from the fire has crept into the walls enough to soften the edge of the cold, and a fragile sense of comfort settles over the cottage. The smell of cooking grain drifting through the air, the soft crackle of wood burning, the quiet padding of the dog curling beside the hearth, the murmur of siblings sharing secrets under their breath while they work. Even the frost on the shutters glows with a kind of soft beauty as the light shifts across its glassy surface, turning the ice crystals into tiny pinpricks of brightness. As the day continues, the family pauses for a simple noon meal, a thin stew, a piece of hard bread dipped into the broth to soften it, and they eat together in calm silence, each spoonful spreading a gentle warmth through their chests. Afterward, the father returns outside to finish the last of his tasks before dusk, knowing that the afternoon light will fade fast, and once it begins to slip, he must return quickly to ensure everything is ready for yet another night, where the cold will press even harder against the cottage walls. The mother and children spend the quiet hours of afternoon preparing the bedding once more, shaking out the blankets, turning the warm stones near the fire so they absorb heat again, patching any new drafts along the floor and walls. Their work is slow and peaceful, performed with the unhurried patience of people who have learned never to race against winter, because winter always wins the race, and only those who move steadily, attentively, survive its long months. When the father finally returns at dusk, brushing snow from his shoulders, the sky outside is already dimming into shades of soft blue and violet, and the first stars tremble faintly behind thin clouds. The children run to him with questions about the animals, about the snow, about the tracks he saw in the forest's edge, and he answers with gentle patience, his voice warm but tired, the calm tone of someone who knows that even a few kind words can warm a room as surely as fire. The family gathers for their last meal of the day, sitting close to the hearth while the evening deepens around them, the wind rising outside as it often does at nightfall, brushing against the shutters with whispered gusts that seem almost curious rather than threatening. The fire glows strong now, strengthened by the wood the father cut earlier, and in its glow the faces of the family look soft and peaceful, illuminated by a warmth that feels deeper than the heat of flame, a warmth of presence, of closeness, of survival shared. After the meal they prepare once more for the long night ahead, repeating the same quiet, practiced rituals that carried them through the last, packing moss into cracks, adjusting blankets, warming stones, checking the embers, and ensuring the bedding is arranged to hold the maximum amount of heat. And though these routines never change, they are performed with a kind of gentle reverence, as if each movement contains a silent blessing for the hours to come. When the time comes to settle into the bedding again, the children curl into the center, the parents around them in a protective ring, and the dog finds its familiar place at their feet, letting its warm body fill the last patch of cold air beneath the blankets. The fire dims slowly as the embers begin their nightly fade, casting soft hues of red and gold across their faces, and the mother murmurs one more low, soothing sound. Not quite a song, not quite a whisper, as the first stars rise outside. The night gathers around the cottage again, wrapping it in darkness and frost, but inside the family breathes together in one steady rhythm, their warmth pooling within the nest of blankets, their presence forming the small, glowing center of a world otherwise quiet and white and cold. And in that fragile glow, in that gentle harmony of breath and sleep, the cottage stands once more against winter, not through strength or grandeur, but through the soft enduring power of closeness. And as the embers pulse faintly and the wind sweeps another wave of snow across the roof, the family drifts towards sleep, knowing that tomorrow will begin the same way, with cold, with work, with dawn, and yet knowing also that they will face it together, warmed by the same fire, sheltered by the same walls, and carried gently through each night by the same unwavering bond that has sustained countless generations through winters long and unforgiving. Thus the day ends as quietly as it began, wrapped in a small, flickering warmth that stands firm against the cold, and the story folds softly into sleep, leaving the cottage glowing faintly in the heart of winter, a fragile but steadfast refuge where endurance, care, and love burn brighter than the darkness outside.